You know, there's a lot in common with Finding Dory and Incredibles 2, and that is that they have very much the same teams, at least the upper echelons in regards to its director, screenwriter, music man, and all of that other stuff. They have the same people brought back as they did for the first movie. And that is why Incredibles 2 feels like Incredibles 1 in very much the same way. Though, Incredibles 2 does suffer from a couple rehashings, but hey, we're deep in the era of superhero fatigue right now. This film does far more serviceable things than half of the superhero films, live-action ones, that have come out in the past 10 years. It's done a lot better than all of those. Now, for Pixar's reputation, is Incredibles 2 up there? Yeah, it definitely is. Especially for the earlier half of the reputation in regards to the latter half era, Incredibles 2 stands out as a very good film, although it has a couple things wrong with it. For the first one, Incredibles 1 has a very good villain. Incredibles 2 has not as good of a villain. Incredibles 1 sets up Buddy to be Syndrome, the bad villain, bad man, from the very first sequence in the film, in the early sequence before Bob and Helen got married, back when they were in their original superhero costumes and all that stuff. That's when Mr. Incredible meets Buddy. And then Buddy grows up. He's a young adult now. He's very rich, big tech guy, and he uses his power, his new wealth and power, to get revenge on superheroes, primarily Mr. Incredible, for what happened to him in the past. That is good motivation that you can stand behind, and you can understand Syndrome and where he's coming from, and you even go, he has point. There's a fumble in the script in Incredibles 2 that really makes the motivation of its villain feel very... well, it makes it wanting. You know, wanting, when you say something is wanting, it means it needs something, it's lacking something, and it needs something extra added into it to make it feel stronger, to make it feel more cohesive, to make it feel like it's a complete thought. This feels like an incomplete thought. This villain feels like it's just a scatterbrained series of thoughts coupled together to make a plot, which doesn't feel as complete as it should be. This feels like a first draft villain that, on paper, I love the Screenslaver. I do. The name is perfect. The mystery aspect in the first half of this film is incredible. It is fantastic. I loved it. But the payoff at the very end, the reveal, the motivations for the villain, none of it really sticks. None of it has a grip. None of it feels, you know? Maybe if it pulled an Incredibles 1 and we had an opening sequence where Helen was younger and she meets this person when they were younger, kind of like a mirror to Incredibles 1 with Mr. Incredible and Buddy. It might be a parallel, but it's a good parallel because it helps us introduce us to the character. You know, it introduces us to the character. And maybe after the time skip, this character is all buddy-buddy with Helen, and everybody goes like, oh, so they actually became a good person. But then they turn out to be the bad guy the whole time. Oh, no. And that would have been a good idea, you know. There's a lot of things that you could come up with to improve this villain. I've come up with half a dozen ideas off the spot right now, immediately. Here's one. Going off of adding that introductory sequence, kind of like the first Incredibles did, you have this villain introduced as a good guy, and is all buddy-buddy with Helen. They create the Screenslaver to basically help promote Helen to be this big hero and be this big star to help undo the superhero ban, and they did this because they idolized Helen. And then Helen looks at this villain after they have revealed themselves to her, and she goes, that's not exactly how we do things. This isn't exactly how I wanted this law to be undone. And this kind of causes a spiral in this fan, and then she turns full coat villain. That would be understandable, that could be understandable. I thought that was where they were going to go with this. I really did, because I already expected one of these two new characters that gets introduced to be the villain that was throughout the first half of the film. I expected one of these two new characters to be the villain, yes, but I expected them to use the screenslaver as a tool to promote superheroes being good and undoing the law through nefarious means, and Helen turns against this person because this isn't exactly the way we're supposed to undo this law, through deceit and manipulation and all that stuff. And that would have been a really cool idea to explore. It really would have, and I'm disappointed that they didn't explore that a little bit further than I would have liked. But from what we got, Incredibles 2 is pretty decent. There are some incredible ideas here. This film improves upon many of the characters introduced in the first film. Admittedly, it also weakens some of the characters introduced in the first film. The character that feels the weakest in comparison to the first film is Dash. Dash also feels slower than he was in the first film. He is supposed to be like the Flash levels of super speed. This guy is supposed to be really friggin' fast. He's so fast the cameras can't catch him. And yet, in this, he seems to be half that speed, a quarter of that speed, a tenth of that speed. He barely gets anything to do. His personality feels even weaker than it was in the first film. It's like the writer forgot what made Dash Dash and just turned him into this extremely hyperactive ADHD child. And admittedly, that makes sense for a speedster character to have ADHD levels of attention span, but there's some more that you could have done for this character. However, there's some pros here. One of the biggest pros, and it's probably going to be pretty divisive, is I loved Jack in this film. I loved it. He was incredible in this film. There's a sequence with a raccoon with Jack that is amazing. It is fantastic. It is so incredible. And I love the dichotomy between the first and the second films in regards to Bob Parr / Mr. Incredible. In the first film, Bob is trying to recapture his glory days as Mr. Incredible, and he kind of neglects what it means to be Bob Parr, neglects what it feels to be Dad. And in this film, Bob realizes that he was neglecting his family a little bit from trying to be Mr. Incredible so often that when Helen goes off to be Elastigirl again, and as a role reversal to the first film, which I do like that idea, Mr. Incredible has to realize that he has to be Bob Parr for a while, and he has to realize that being a dad also is pretty super, and there's a lot of family dynamic involved here. I once said when I first watched Incredibles 1 a long time ago, and when I rewatched it a couple years ago, I said that I would have loved the idea of using this family, this superhero family, and making a sort of sitcom out of it. You don't need villains that are going to take over the world, that are going to oh no, there's big things about it. No, sometimes you could just have something be as simple as Bob needing to learn math to teach his son the math that he's struggling with in school. That's a pretty cool concept, that this dude who could lift cars like they weigh pennies has to pick up a textbook and learn math because they changed math since he was a kid. That is so incredibly relatable that they made the superhero relatable. I think that's what makes Peter Parker so incredible, is that we relate to Peter Parker so strongly that when he becomes Superman, juggles those identities. It's very relatable. It's very fun. when we have these characters juggle their superhero personas with their real lives, it's relatable. The real lives are relatable because those are the lives that we live, and these guys are just incredible people that still have to live these normal lives. I loved that dichotomy. I loved that approach with Bob and trying to be a dad again to these kids, and that was a very good, very strong component to this movie that I think is one of his biggest strengths. Bob learning that Jack has superpowers is also incredible. But I do think that could have been explored in the first film, but if it's explored here, that's fine too. Another character that does feel like they have improved quite a bit is Violet. Violet has more of a character. They continue that teenage drama with relationship stuff that she was worried about. In the first film, they continued to explore that in this second film, and she's pretty improved. Her powers are also pretty improved, and I like how they explored different ways and avenues that she could do her powers, which is also pretty fun. Frozone, always glad to see him. Edna, she's also pretty fun to have here. Elastigirl / Mrs. Incredible, she does have a lot to do in this film. She basically takes over Bob's role in this film. Like how in the first film, Mr. Incredible gets to recapture his glory days when he ends up working for the villain unknowingly to put on the suit again and do some superhero stuff all incognito and get paid for it, which is very fun. And I loved that. And in this one, it's Helen who gets to put the suit on and go work for these politician people. One of them ends up being the villain, and she ends up getting to do some missions and stuff, which is very fun. It's a very good twist, and I do like to see various super abilities that Helen has. I love to see her cycle that can split in half using her stretchy powers. Although, admittedly, the first film has one of the best sequences with Helen that I've ever seen. Like, between both of these, even the stuff I've seen with Mr. Incredible, not Mr. Incredible, but Mr. Fantastic in the Fantastic Four, another stretchy man. The sequence with Helen in the first film when she's breaking into Syndrome's facility and she's doing all sorts of Mission Impossible stuff, which I do have to mention that the director of these films also did Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible, one of the best films in that franchise. So understandably it makes sense why the music feels Mission Impossible, why there's a lot of stealth sequences in that first film. It is very powerful, it is very good. I don't feel like they explore her powers in the ways that it could have been explored. Helen definitely would work for infiltration and stuff like that, and we didn't really see too much of that, but I do like that she has a villain of her own, that she gets to find out who the villain is in her own unique way, using her own unique superpowers and deduction powers. And I love how the kids keep calling her on the cycle, her little phone, while she's out there trying to chase the bad guy. That's pretty funny, but ultimately she didn't have as good of a portrayal of her powers as she did in the first film. There's a sequence with some doors that are closing where she gets trapped in a door and she gets trapped in another part of the door. Her leg is sticking out of one part of the door, her hand sticking out of another part of the door, and so her leg has to beat up a villain. Her hand in one part of the door stuck in the elevator has to beat up some villains in there. Her waist is stuck in between a hallway, like it's stretched into between two doors that she's trapped in, and then one of the doors opens and her legs grabs two more guys, and it is so good to look at. That sequence was incredible and very, very, very creative, very innovative, and creative with a stretchy character. I loved that moment. We don't get a moment even close to that in this second film, but for the most part, Helen is serviceable. She isn't weakened. She is not strengthened either. She's just serviceable. Bob, I feel, is strengthened in regards to the Bob Parr character. We get to explore more of that character rather than his Mr. Incredible persona, which may disappoint some people who wanted to see him just be Mr. Incredible and punch stuff. So that may disappoint some people. Was happy to see Bob. I was happy to see him explain. I was happy to see them explore more of that. The film is not better than the first one, but it is also not that much worse than it. It does have some things that are poor, like a poor villain, very poor villain, and Dash is very poorly executed. But it does stuff that I think this film does better than the first film, which is explore more of this family dynamic, explore Bob's character, explore Jack, and it really does help explore their marriage and how they parent children, and the dichotomy of how Helen was the one who usually took care of the kids, and this is a foreign position for Bob, so he has to learn how to handle these three kids, and that's very good. I think that's done a little better here, because we barely see Helen handle the kids. It's just expected that she knows how to handle the kids. We don't really see it, but then again, it's very easy for her, probably, so I love that dichotomy. Overall, as an overall film, it's not better than the first one, but it's not that much worse either. I would say, if I'm going to give The Incredibles 1 a 9, I'd give The Incredibles 2 an 8. It's very close. They're very good films. And honestly, I enjoy this one more than Finding Dory, though there's a segment in Finding Dory that I think it's one of the most heartfelt moments in almost all of these sequels that I've ever seen. Better than Toy Story 3, especially better than Toy Story 4. Better than The Incredibles 2, because The Incredibles 2 has a lot of good moments, but there's no heartfelt moments, like something that's a real tearjerker. In Finding Dory, there's a sequence with shells near the end of the film, when Dory finally finds her parents, that really pulls at the heartstrings. It really does, and the film actually manages to pull that off because they built it. They built it from the start of the film. They built this stuff with the shells into the ending sequence, and that was very good. That was very smart. That was very well done. It's very emotional. Not as emotional as the first film, obviously, but Finding Dory does have a really good moment, that really emotional moment that Incredibles 2 fails to have, though I like Incredibles 2 more than Finding Dory overall, as a whole. So that's Incredibles 2. Up next, we'll do Toy Story 4 eventually. I don't know when. I'll probably do some stuff in between this one and Toy Story 4. But Toy Story 4 will probably be the last Pixar film I talk about for a while, because there's none that I really am that interested in seeing after this one, except maybe Cars 2. Maybe, I'm not sure. I don't really care about Cars. I like the first Cars. I have the first Cars, but it's not something I really want to talk about. But I really loved The Incredibles growing up. I really loved Finding Nemo growing up. And of course, Toy Story 1 and 2 are the best Pixar films ever made. So obviously, I watched Toy Story 3 and 4 because I loved the first two. And I wanted to see 4. We'll get to 4. Okay? We'll get there. We'll get there. But Incredibles 2 is safe. Watch it.